Hey everyone, so One Piece chapter 1070 just came out, and this set up for a very exciting climax to the Egghead Island arc. That is, if it is going to wrap up here. One of the important things that people have been pointing out is that even though it seems as though everything is coming to a head right now with a big clash between the Straw Hats, the Marines, CP0, and the Seraphim, at the same time, right next door we have some very important members of Sword, as well as Tashigi, probably Smoker. And then right next to them is Blackbeard's island, so for all we know, this could spiral into something even bigger. But for the time being, let's assume that this is the close to Egghead Island. If so, I think we've got a phenomenal set of probably 5 to 15 chapters probably left for this arc, just because Kizaru's on his way. And the world government side is basically completely squatted back up with CP0 and the Seraphim on one end, the Marines on the other end. I don't know, this is some very exciting stuff we've got here. Who would have thought that we'd be right here 10 chapters ago, right? After having just closed the Onigashima conflict with such a huge scale war right there. This isn't quite the same scale in terms of sheer numbers, but in terms of prominent enemies to defeat, I think it's actually pretty damn close. So I don't know if this is what the rest of post-time skip, the final saga, is going to look like. Oda did mention that the rest of One Piece is going to feel like a huge battle royale. If this is what we've got in store chapter after chapter, I mean, how long back do we have Law versus Blackbeard? I think that One Piece is going to be having us on the edge of our seat from here till the final chapter. So this is pretty awesome. This is giving me such high hopes for the rest of the story. But before we get into it, make sure to grab your posters, because if you enjoyed seeing Gear 5th Luffy this chapter, well, you can get a masterful rendition of Gear 5th Luffy in a dark and epic art style by artist Waffalo, along with other depictions such as Marco vs. King, Blackbeard, Black Maria, and of course the Battle of Monsters on Onigashima. All by artist Waffalo, link in the description below to grab them for yourself from the Mord store. That aside, with this chapter specifically, we got our climax to Luffy versus Lucci. I think one of my favorite aspects of this is that the fact that Luffy had to save Sentomaru here, because if we rewind right to Sabaody, just the sense of growth that we get from the fact that Sentomaru used to once be able to just bully Luffy, right? Sentomaru was once so much stronger than Luffy. Luffy couldn't even understand what he was doing to him or how he was able to hurt him, right? And at this point, Luffy is so much stronger than Sentomaru that Luffy can basically casually almost effortlessly take out the guy that's basically complete, like Lucci, who's basically completely stomping Sentomaru. So from Luffy's perspective, he now looks down at like the way their interactions were this chapter, it felt like Luffy looks down from so high up at Sentomaru as basically, Battle Axe, what's going on, right? Oh, you need help? Okay, let me take care of this for you or whatever. It's such a different dynamic than what we once had. It's really, really cool to see. Even just thinking back to the start of post-time skip with Luffy running into Sentomaru. Sentomaru was the first significant Marine figure that Luffy ran into there, and look at where they're at now. Look at how far Luffy's come, not even just from pre-time skip, but from post-time skip, the very beginning, like chapter 600-ish, to where he's at now at chapter 1070. It's crazy to think about. So I love that aspect of it. In terms of Luffy versus Lucci in itself, this chapter was more so how I, and I think many other people, expected it to go last chapter. Most people never even thought that Luffy would have to use Gear 5th. I'm still of the opinion that Luffy probably didn't have to use Gear 5th. I think he could have taken care of Lucci in straight up base form. But Oda definitely wanted to showcase Gear 5th again because it was important for the story to have Vegapunk observe it, and also probably for have the Straw Hats to be kind of a little bit more aware of what's going on with Luffy's new abilities. So, but the important segue, it seemed, was having Vegapunk. We needed a trigger for Vegapunk to give a full explanation regarding Devil Fruits and what Luffy actually is at this point. So that makes sense. It also seems, I talked about this in my podcast, but it seems like Luffy just enjoys using Gear 5th. I think he genuinely has a lot of fun using it. So whatever drawbacks it may have, such as making him very tired and everything like that after the fight, I don't think Luffy cares, because it seems like it's just his favorite way to fight. I think that from here on, we're probably going to see Gear 5th a lot more frequently, even than we used to see Gear 4th, just because it feels like Oda really enjoys writing Gear 5th fights. This is probably how Oda wanted to write fights for the longest time. And Luffy as a character enjoys using Gear 5th, regardless of the drawback. So yeah, Gear 5th, I think it's not just here to stay. I think it's going to be very commonplace from here on out. I say all that, and who knows, maybe Kizaru shows up and then for whatever reason we see Luffy fighting in base form for the entire time. I don't know, but I would love to see more Gear 5th. It makes for some very zany creative fights. This chapter, I think the kicker was probably the rocket goggles that Luffy put on. I think that's what got everybody excited, because that's something a little new, right? I think Oda is going to have to keep thinking of sort of new Looney Tunes uses of Luffy's abilities that he hasn't quite put into play yet. And that was a new trick that he pulled out of the hat. So that was cool to see, you know, because we've seen the giant thing before, right? Like Luffy turning gigantic. We've seen a few of the previous tricks, right? We've seen him manipulating the ground and stuff like he did at the end of last chapter before. But the goggles thing, that's a nice little added touch. So as long as we keep getting stuff like that, sign me up for more Gear 5th fights. I love it. Again, should he have taken Lucci out more easily? It's hard to say. I think this chapter makes it seem as though Luffy could have taken Lucci out right off the bat if he really wanted to. It's just, you know, it's Luffy. The way he fights it's not as, you know, he can take some time to get really serious. And I think with Gear 5th, that actually exacerbates that aspect of his fighting style, because it's just like, it's Gear 5th. So it's, it in itself is a goofy fighting style that doesn't take itself too seriously. So it kind of plays into Luffy's own natural tendency to start off a little less serious, and eventually over the course of a long battle, he gets more and more into, you know, what he can actually do, and, you know, actually his true level of strength. So yeah, let's get used to that. Luffy's not always going to feel like a Yonko, I guess, at the end of the day, but when he gets down to it, he can finish off a character like Lucci without that much of a problem. And let's not knock Lucci over any of this, because Lucci, again, legitimately lasting 2 chapters against this Luffy, that's not what most people expected, right? That's punching way above what you would expect out of Lucci, right? You swap in a lot of characters here that would probably do worse, right? Even someone like Katakuri or something like that, characters that we all think of very highly. Lucci was unfortunate enough to have to fight against a Yonko, it's just going to be out of his punching range, right? You put Lucci in against Shanks, this is what would happen. You put Lucci against Mihawk, this is what's going to happen, right? So let's not knock Lucci for any of this. You put Lucci against Kaido, this is what's going to happen, right? Probably they would take care of him a little bit easier, but this is where Luffy's at right now. He's a Yonko. I think the whole point of this is that he's supposed to be starting to get some respect as a Yonko, so we should think of him that way as well. This is not a bad look for Lucci. It's just that, you know, it's kind of like Kaido said to Jack when Jack was getting messed up by the minks, you know, Inuarashi, Nekomamushi in Sulong form on the roof, right? It's not that you're weak, Jack. These characters are just really strong. So it's not that Lucci's weak. It's just that Luffy's very possibly top 5 character. For all we know, Luffy is top 5 strongest characters in the world right now, and he might not even be number 5. He might be a little bit higher. We don't know. I think he's no less than 7. We kind of did this on stream at some point. I'd say he's no less than 7, probably no higher than like 3 or something. I don't know, he's somewhere in there. Anyway, that's something to consider. So Luffy versus Lucci aside, let's talk about the Seraphim very briefly. There is a video I want to do on the Seraphim again, just because I did a video when they were first introduced. But now that we have full context surrounding the Seraphim, it makes them a lot more interesting. And there's a lot of reasons I feel, narratively and in terms of hints and in terms of build-up that we've gotten towards them, that what Vegapunk is saying, or I forget exactly what was said, but it was said this chapter, you know, the chapter title, the strongest beings, right? The idea that the Seraphim could become the strongest beings on the sea, all of that. I don't think that might sound like an exaggeration. I think that there's a lot of signs that point to that not being necessarily an exaggeration or hyperbole. You know, I don't think they're gonna be stronger than Im or End of Story Luffy or certain characters, obviously, at the end of the day. But the idea that Seraphim could be considered basically tippy top tier characters by the end of the story, I think that that's very, very, very possible, maybe even likely, just based around a lot of reasons that I would hope to put into a video very soon. But I don't think that's something to be taken lightly. I think the fact that what we're seeing right now is them at a very high threat level, right? A very, very high threat level. Like a single Jinbei Seraphim was able to give the crew some degree of trouble, right? Not nothing crazy, but some degree of trouble. And the single Mihawk Seraphim was able to give Blackbeard a scare. Again, he's not going to take out Blackbeard just like that, but he did give Blackbeard a bit of a scare and cut a mountain in half, right? These are all the baby versions of the Seraphim. That's been made very, very clear that they're nowhere close to their full potential. And I really think we haven't seen a lot of aspects of their full potential just yet. we're dealing with basically the tadpole versions of what they're eventually going to be. So that's something very, very important to keep in mind. And I think that with the rest of the battles of this arc playing out, I assume we're going to get to see them more in action against the Straw Hats, which will give us a better gauge of where they're at right now as babies and kind of extrapolate to what they're going to look like when they're at their full potential, because I do think that that is set to be for a variety of reasons. I keep saying that in a very vague way, but for certain reasons, again, that I'll explain in another video, I think that that's actually going to be very, very important to the finale of the story, and I think to some of the final battles of the story, potentially. So, Seraphim, really, really interesting. I don't think we should take what was said this chapter lightly, or the title of this chapter lightly. I think that they are, unless they all get taken out now, which I don't think is going to be the case, I think that they are here to stay, and I think that they're going to be very, very significant players in the rest of the story going forward. So, that's interesting. Final part is Kizaru's on his way. I talked about that a little bit, but the fact that he is on his way, it opens up a lot of possibilities because, you know, we could finally get to see Luffy versus Kizaru. I talked about this multiple times when the last chapter first came out, right? I talked about this on stream. So when 1069 came out, I talked about how Luffy post defeat at Sabaody, when he was on Amazon Lily, he was talking about 3 characters we want to surpass. We want to surpass Sentomaru, Kuma, Kizaru, right? All 3 characters lined up here again. I'm going to talk about this in depth in a video coming out on Tuesday, but I think it's very, very significant that Oda chose those 3 characters to assemble again on this island, and I think Kizaru is the final key piece really to kind of potentially righting the wrong or reversing the script from what we got all the way back then in Sabaody and set a very different tone for what the Straw Hats are going to be going forward. So I'm excited to see potentially Luffy versus Kizaru, potentially Zoro or Sanji or somebody else versus Kizaru. Maybe we get the Straw Hats versus Kizaru to kind of be the ones to protect Luffy this time, since he's a bit drained at the moment. Although I would of course love to see Luffy versus an Admiral. Maybe we just don't get that matchup because Oda's like, well, Luffy just fought Kaido. He can mop the floor with Lucci. We don't need to see him against Kizaru or something like that. I would still personally love to see it just to get a solid gauge of where things are at, but I just think Kizaru is the perfect guy to send over here right now. The only thing I ask for is that what I would like to see is that we actually get a fight. I would hate for this to be a Jack situation where Jack gets sent over, gets taken out by Zunisha. That was perfect for the Zoe arc, 100% perfect for the Zoe arc. This is a very different feel right now where it really feels as though Oda is setting us up for, you know, a big fight, right? That's the way that this chapter sort of ended. So, you know, all the world government forces assembled, Marines coming on the other side. It feels as though we're set up for a big climactic fight. It would be very disappointing if we don't get that. It's very different from the Jack situation where it's like, oh, Jack's coming back, what could happen? And then we get a surprise twist. This feels like we're setting up for a brawl. So to be robbed of that, I would be very disappointed. So I hope we get the fight. I hope at the same time that whatever happens to Kizaru, he is not taken out of the rest of the story. Just because, look, the world government's sitting there with Akainu. Obviously, no disrespect to Akainu. Great. But he's only one man. Fleet Admiral, right? And what he would have working for him at that point is Green Bull, the sorriest excuse for an admiral we've ever seen. And then Fujitora, who's probably going to defect by the end of the day because he does not rock with the world government and the way they do things when all is said and done. So let's hope that Kizaru, whatever happens, 1, he gets to fight, but 2, he's not down for the count, you know, at least for the rest of the story. That's doable, obviously. We saw Lucci just went down and he got back up, so characters can lose and get back up, but it's just, you know, if it turns into a very dramatic, significant fight, you know, those type of fights that Luffy has, the really, really big, like, heavyweight ones, whether he has at the end of significant arcs, you know, like against a Crocodile or Doflamingo. Usually when Luffy beats characters like that, they're down and out for a while because that's just how significant and how, you know, how I guess, intense and brutal the fights tend to get. Egghead's probably too short of an arc, I assume, for it to get like that for Kizaru, so we'll see. But all that being said, really great chapter, and more so, really great setup for amazing stuff to come for the rest of Egghead Island, however long that may be. So, hope you enjoyed this video, and I will talk to you all next week.